Hello, and welcome to this webinar that is being co-sponsored with Witness for Peace, Solidarity Collective, the Latin America Working Group, the International Institute on Race and Equality, the Colombia Human Rights Committee, the Center for Justice and International Law, and Amnesty International. Also, hello to all of our viewers that are listening through Contagio Radio in Colombia. My name is Semana Sanchez, and I'm the director of the Andes at the Washington Office on Latin America. As the entire world is grappling with the unprecedented COVID pandemic that is straining all available resources, we are starting to see how structural inequalities are a major source of problems around the world. In Colombia, the situation is particularly complex because in 2016 it recently signed a peace, but it still has ongoing conflict with other illegal groups. And it also is grappling not only with the pandemic, but with the mass migrations of Venezuelans across its borders. Earlier today, WOLA put out an urgent action, and what we're finding is incredibly concerning, both in terms of the lack of effective response to Colombians suffering in areas where there is COVID, how the structural inequalities are affecting that, but also that there are continued situations of insecurity that are particularly targeting human rights defenders and social leaders. In the midst of this pandemic, the Colombia weekly news magazine Semana dropped another bombshell, which revealed that the Colombian military intelligence units had carried out illicit surveillance on more than 130 individuals between February and December. Among those targeted were human rights defenders, Colombian international journalists, politicians, labor leaders, members of the military. Several of the people targeted were targeted because they were reporting and documenting or representing families of extrajudicial killings and trying to bring to light grave abuses. Sadly, illegal espionage is not a new phenomenon in Colombia. As you all may recall, in 2011, Colombia's former intelligence agency, the Administrative Security Directorate, was dismantled after revelations in 2009 that it had been illegally wiretapping and monitoring the activity of civil society leaders, judges, politicians, and even among those folios were different things that WOLA had put out. The recent revelations therefore ask, why is this continuing to happen? What needs to happen so that we have real accountability, so that we have real reforms, so that this doesn't continue to occur? What should be done to end illicit surveillance of social leaders? And for us in the United States, we would like to know what role can the US government play in achieving all of this? And given that the US is Colombia's top military donor and trainer, what role, if any, is there or linked to the United States? We will also be hearing about today what the OAS and the United Nations can do and what the implications are of all this to the Colombia 2016 Peace Accord consolidation. So since there's a lot to discuss here, we've gathered 6 individuals who've been targeted by this illegal surveillance and 3 US-based human rights experts to help us unpack all of this. And more importantly, to recommend to all of us what should be done to address both the security of the victims concerned and to stop this cycle from continuing to happen. So the way we will do it today is that I will briefly introduce all of them at the start, and then right before they speak, I will remind everyone who is speaking. They will each talk for about 10 minutes. As you're aware, there is simultaneous translation taking place in the 2 WOLA YouTube channels, thanks to Kathy Ogle and Sierra Gomez. And we remind our speakers to speak not too quickly so that they can do that properly. At the same time, we are taking questions through the hashtag WOLA Colombia. Please submit any questions or comments by posting it on Twitter with that hashtag. So our first speaker will be Senator Ivan Cepeda, a human rights defender and politician trained in philosophy. He was the representative in the Colombian Congress from 2010 to 2014 and is now a senator for the Alternative Democratic Pole Party. As senator, he is also a member of the Second Commission of the Colombian Senate, that is the constitutionally mandated Senate commission set up to examine military forces, police, and national security. He is very well known for his role in the movement of victims of state crimes, Movice, that brought together family members and organizations that were involved in victims of state crimes. And he's a leading voice in the Defend the Peace movement in Colombia. After Ivan, we will hear from Danilo Rueda, who is a founding director of the Interecclesial Commission for Justice and Peace, the human rights NGO that received the WOLA Human Rights Prize in 2015 for its outstanding contribution to peace and human rights. Justicia y Paz accompanies both legally and physically multiple victims and resistance communities throughout Colombia who have been pioneering concepts of self-protection and mechanisms such as humanitarian and biodiversity zones. After Danilo, we will hear from Cesar Jerez, who is a land rights and peace activist and longtime promoter and advocate of the Campesino Reserve Zones, and is currently the president of Frutos de Paz, or Fruits of Peace. He will be followed by Yomari Otergon Osorio, human rights defender, lawyer with CAJAR, a collective of lawyers that represents victims of human rights abuses committed by the Colombian state, paramilitaries, and members of the military, often at great personal risk. In 2012, CAJAR was awarded the National Human Rights Prize for Best Collective Process in Colombia, and Yomari has extensive litigation experience before the Inter-American System of Human Rights. After Yomari, we will hear from John Otis, journalist that has been based in Colombia since 1997. John reports for National Public Radio, Wall Street Journal, and is the author of the book Law of the Jungle. We often hear his reports here in the US over the radio about the plight of Venezuelan migrants in Colombia, the effects of COVID in the Andes, and conflict-related issues in both Colombia and Venezuela. Nicolas Badoya will follow John. He is a member of the Vela Collective and editor of the Nudo del Paramillo Peace Observatory. Nicholas has published features in numerous outlets, including America's Quarterly, BBC, Bloomberg News, and Ventana Abierta. In 2018, he was forcibly displaced from Colombia due to his work in Ituango. And he joins us, even though he's recently profiled by the Colombian Army in Special Case Number 1 as the top source for New York Times former Andes director Nick Casey. So we will hear from our 6 directly affected persons, and then after that, we will have some comment from, first, my colleague, Adam Isaacson, who's the Director for Defense and Oversight at WOLA, where he works on security and U.S. military aid in the region. He is also the host of WOLA's Latin America podcast that contains some really great recent interviews with academics and others on Colombia that everyone should check out. And with Adam, we jointly do colombiapeace.org, which is a website that is dedicated to trends and developments in Colombia's peace process, which I recommend everybody to sign up to receive. After Adam, we will have Viviana Kristesevich, the director for SEGIL, a human rights organization that represents victims with litigation and protection mechanisms in the Inter-American System. And lastly, we will have, but not obviously last, but perhaps the best, Lisa Haugard, the executive director of the Latin America Working Group. Lisa has been a major advocate for many years in terms of U.S. policy in the region, and she leads the Colombia Steering Committee, which is the grouping of civil society organizations that follow and advocate for Colombia human rights here in the United States. So again, if you have any questions, please do hashtag WOLA Colombia, and
All right. Thank you so much, Jimena, and to the people and organizations that work to uphold human rights in Colombia and those who organize this forum. To be able to briefly explain everything in these 10 minutes, I'm going to dive straight into the topics. And I first want to outline a very brief summary of the current situation and make some brief reflections about the wrongdoings. The first thing that should be noted to you all is that Colombia has used the state security apparatus for decades through its use of intelligence agencies, the armed forces, and particularly the police force, using the apparatus as a weapon or an instrument for what they claim as security, but instead targets the opposition, human rights defenders, members of social movements, journalists, and people who form part of the judicial branch, etc. But we are currently facing a different type of situation. These recent wrongdoings are unique and have been occurring since 2017. And I want to quickly identify the features that make them so unique. First of all, this is not simply about one specific criminal component within the military. There are two realities that are closely connected. In 2017, the Colombian government, at the time under President Juan Manuel Santos, decided to request the entry of the Colombian military to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. NATO demanded that the Colombian military undertake a counterintelligence initiative that would target corrupt elements of the armed forces, since at the time there were reports against such wrongdoings. This initiative was initially called Dante and then later renamed Operation Baston. It consisted of 20 missions that were able to identify 16 generals and 250 officials and sub-officials involved in grave wrongdoings of corruptions and other grave abuses, with close links to drug trafficking groups like the Gulf Clan, the Office of Envigado, paramilitary groups, and even the National Liberation Army and dissidents of the FARC. The investigations produced a report of over 5,000 pages that some journalists consider come to the caliber of a WikiLeaks scandal against the Colombian armed forces. However, the initiative was countered and basically eliminated when General Nicasio Martinez became head of the Colombian Armed Forces, who you all are familiar with for having provoked many journalistic exposés. In particular, the New York Times reported and accused General Martinez for attempting to revive Colombia's extrajudicial killing scheme known as false positives. General Martinez erased the counterintelligence evidence and put Operation Baston to a halt, and he transferred over 200 officials who were responsible for collecting the counterintelligence evidence. He named General Quinos, one of his subordinates, as the new head of intelligence for the armed forces. General Quiros created the new intelligence scheme, which is what is now being considered the new episode of military espionage against over at least 130 people, but it is said to probably be over 300 people and may even include Congress representatives, journalists, human rights defenders, social leaders, and judges from all different types of domestic courts. This particular intelligence scandal is now in the eye of the hurricane and is currently being debated within Colombian civil society. But what is not so well known is Operation Baston, which was the previous episode of intelligence. But before my speaking time ends, I'm going to identify 11 points that I believe should be taken into consideration with these episodes of illegal espionage. The first point is that it was solely the work of journalists and of human rights defenders that helped bring to light the latest episode of illicit intelligence. The president and the Minister of Defense have only made statements based on rhetoric and limited to administrative obligations surrounding these types of situations. The worrying part is that the measures being used to face this scandal contribute to the revolving door we see with high-level military positions. When an episode of wrongdoing occurs, those responsible are transferred to other units of the military while public attention on the scandal dies down. There are many cases, like that of General Garcia Luna, for example, who was involved in this latest episode of Espionage, that have been continuously involved in military scandals in the past decade, even in the espionage scandal of the former Administrative Department of Security that was dissolved in 2011. The second point I want to make is that the narrative the government created intentionally negated this recent scandal and then proceeded to hide or minimize the magnitude of the scandal. It attempted to minimize the necessity for Operation Baston and framed the illicit surveillance as simply routine profiling. They are treating the information from the surveillance like a public database with records of the victims the scandal targeted. The government has also negated that both intelligence scandals are related. The findings of Operation Baston and this recent episode of military espionage. The third point I want to make is that Operation Baston reveals that narco trafficking and military strategy against the former have been a source of an abashment process for the Colombian armed forces and the police. It reveals that there is a deep-rooted faction inside the armed forces and the police that is corrupt and connected to the extreme right of the country, and is tightly connected to narco trafficking and has clear intentions to debilitate or end the peace agreement's implementation. The fourth point I want to make is that we must follow the ties that different generals and officials have had with the Gulf Clan, the Office of Envigado, the Pelusos group that operates in Catatumbo, and other narco-trafficking and paramilitary groups. This helps debunk the narrative that narco-trafficking only exists outside of state institutions. The fifth point I want to note is that it is necessary that the findings of the Operation Baston report are widely shared. It is said that there is a copy of this report in Washington, D.C., and I believe it is necessary that U.S. Congress representatives that work to uphold human rights demand that the findings of the Operation Baston report be widely shared in the United States, since U.S. taxpayer money has been identified in links to narco-trafficking and in illicit espionage against human rights activists, opposition members, and members of the judicial branch. The sixth point I want to make is that despite the fact that various cases from Operation Baston were submitted to the Attorney General's office under Humberto Nestor Martinez, there have not been any sustained sanctions, not even in the Inspector General's office or the Comptroller's office, since there are cases of illicit enriching. This is to say there has not been one action for justice in regards to these grave wrongdoings. The seventh point I'd like to make is that it is relevant the fact that in the journalistic exposés, in the findings of Operation Baston, and in this recent scandal of military espionage, that many politicians from the Democratic Center political party appear either as solicitants or interceptors of the illegally obtained information. Eighth point. In this particular situation, it is evident that the internal enemy military doctrine continues to be the basis for training intelligence officials in the Colombian military. I must remind everyone that the UN Rapporteur for Extrajudicial Executions in 1990 and 94, the UN Rapporteur Against Torture, and most recently, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Situation of Human Rights Defenders in both 2018 and 2019 reminded that this military doctrine continues to prevail in the Colombian military. Ninth point. There is a sector of officials that have bravely opposed the wrongdoings and have attempted to denounce the abuses. They have also been victims of the operations occurring inside the Colombian military. So we must condemn the treatment of whistleblowers who are just being honest and transparent about the situation. 10th point. The current danger is that there are still generals and officials active in the military that participated in these wrongdoings, so the armed forces have not been sanctioned or reformed. Last point. We plead for structural reform within the Colombian armed forces. We must revise promotions in the military. We must rid the military of its corrupt elements and of members who violate human rights. We must demand for intelligence and counterintelligence laws that truly put an end to these attacks against democracy, against peace, against human rights, against social leaders who have been systematically assassinated. I have no doubt that with adequate investigations of the illegal intelligence and counterintelligence, we can reveal how these leaders have been assassinated. Hundreds and hundreds of leaders throughout the territories of our country. Thank you so much, Semana. And with this, I conclude my presentation.
Thank you so much, Senator Cepeda. We will now hear from Danilo Reda from the Interecclesial Commission for Justice and Peace.
Buenas tardes, Jimena, y a todo el equipo de Bola, y a todos los que nos están observando y escuchando. Entre ellos.
Good afternoon, Jimena, and to everyone at WOLA, and to everyone watching and listening, even to those responsible for the military espionage, the 150 members of the armed forces and intelligence agencies that conducted this illicit surveillance. To them, I also send my greetings. I would like to share two themes during my presentation. The first I would like to point out is that we've been exposed to these types of wrongdoings since the 1970s, where there has been a lack of political willingness to empower civil society protection, an inability to ensure that the armed forces respect human rights, and a context where the military can shelter itself using international normative frameworks in its illicit intelligence operations. The operations that have unraveled in Colombia since the 1970s have had grave consequences. From these operations, the basis or the logic of paramilitary operations was created, and they have had grave consequences, resulting in torture, assassinations, and forced disappearances. These wrongdoings continue occurring and do so with impunity. How are these situations traditionally viewed? Well, how Senator Ivan Cepeda pointed out, there are sectors within the Colombian military and the police force and in intelligence agencies that are critical voices inside the military, but then they are cast aside or negated with their critiques or observations when human rights violations occur. It's in those moments when whistleblowers need to take personal risks to be able to denounce the wrongdoings through mechanisms that are more low-key, since official state institutions don't provide the avenues so that adequate investigations and internal controls and oversight function correctly. My second part is that these acts of profiling are not new. They are part of intelligence and counterintelligence mechanisms designed to identify who they should target. It should be pointed out that in this recent episode of military espionage, many of the assassinations of social leaders would be explained with these profilings that arise from the databases that have been created. And many social leaders who appear in these databases have already been assassinated. My third point is that it is not new to identify that many who operate illegally have been trained at the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation in the United States. For this reason, in public declarations, we must call on U.S. Congress representatives to see the controls, oversight, and trainings that these type of military officials are receiving, since these officials are the ones responsible for this track record of wrongdoings and grave abuses, as noted in the various press reports published. My fourth point is that when these wrongdoings begin to be revealed, there are always modifications to the charges and sanctions against state agents. They move from one state institution to another, including the General Attorney Office. We see how many members of the armed forces have been transferred to the Attorney General's office and have been involved in these so-called counterterrorism crackdowns and have used illegal methods to execute judicial persecution and execute illegal operations. We could ask, what's new? These scandals that have been brought to the forefront recently occurred after the implementation of Law 1621 of 2013, where in a joint normative framework, it was sought to strengthen the framework that allows intelligence and counterintelligence agencies to fulfill their constitutional obligations. But what has been demonstrated is that this law is unable to generate adequate oversight mechanisms so that the wrongdoings we're seeing now do not repeat themselves. The major question that should be asked is, why in 2013, the factions of Álvaro Uribe's administration refused to accept the recommendations of the advisory committee that, with its civilian oversight nature, made several recommendations regarding Law 1621 of 2013. This is a major question that must be answered. The second theme I'd like to focus on is what is new about this recent scandal of military espionage. Evidently, new mechanisms have been developed that are interrelated. The traditional forms of intelligence and the new illicit intelligence are now combining with informational intelligence. The major question here is, after the revelation of these scandals, after the revelations of the findings of Operation Baston, as noted by Senator Cepeda, we must not only focus on how many profiling cases exist, but we also need to ask what has happened to the databases with the illegally collected information. Where is this database? Well, these databases have either been deleted or stolen, as also occurred with the former Administrative Department of Security scandal. This is why the major question is, and why a rigorous investigation should be conducted, what happened with the databases? Where are they? My third point is that another new dynamic in this recent scandal is that this military espionage occurred after the ratification of a peace agreement. One would think that these shortcomings in Colombia's democracy regarding political liberties would be overcome after signing a peace agreement. So why was it impossible to engage in a conversation in the context of peace negotiations to address this outdated military doctrine? Why was the clamor of civil society, of victims, ignored when pleading for discussions on reforming Colombian military doctrine, especially in a context of transitioning from war to peace? Why does this continue to be impossible? My fourth point, Colombia is evidently turning to the privatization of public security to appease to the interests of a particular faction of the government. It is turning to using public security to maintain corporate, military, and political sectors that have deep ties to corruption and narco-trafficking, with illicit operations that inflict violence on Colombian citizens. So to this end, there are many questions. How do we truly ensure that there are civilian oversight mechanisms that include opposition members that overview intelligence operations in Colombia? How do we ensure a positive role regarding the involvement of the United States and the U.S. Congress to ensure that U.S. military aid to Colombia truly allows for the consolidation of democracy and not the strengthening of a facade of a democracy that is tainted and upholds criminality. Thank you so much. Good morning, all. Apologies for the technical difficulties. I'm not used to this virtual environment. I'd like to start by saying hi to Semana, to all the colleagues at WOLA and in the United States, and to my colleagues here in Colombia. This webinar is occurring amid a very important and interesting political context in Colombia. I want to start off with why this type of surveillance or military and police espionage is conducted on civil society leaders. Generally, with social movements by farmers, by indigenous peoples, and by Afro-Colombians, this surveillance has been conducted with two objectives. The first is to stage judicial proceedings, which historically have subsequently been filtered to the Attorney General's office and then result in prosecutions and in many arrests. Obviously, this situation was intensely endured throughout the Álvaro Uribe administration's 2 terms in office. Intelligence reports were used to illegally detain individuals, massive cases of arbitrary detentions that violated the freedoms of thousands of Colombians. This is something that continues to occur even today. The largest implication of these recent intelligence reports is that many cases in Colombia have been used to kill social leaders, labor leaders, agricultural leaders, indigenous leaders, Afro-Colombian leaders, as Senator Cepeda and Danilo clearly pointed out. This is what is so concerning. Intelligence resources are still being used. So everyone is made aware of the magnitude of this scandal. I want to let you know that I'm a victim of this surveillance and I am seeking justice. The surveillance tracked my work with the Farmers Association for the Cimitarra River Valley. It resulted in judicial stagings and went before the Attorney General's office. I had to leave the country. I was exiled between 2006 and 2010. The surveillance on my whereabouts continued when I was in Europe. Let's say this is another aggravating aspect of the military's illegal espionage. Much of the time, these intelligence reports have disseminated to international audiences, and not just the United States, where a lot of this information has not gained traction. In this recent case, the narrative of an internal enemy is built inside the country in Colombia, but at the same time, this narrative extends to international audiences. In Europe, I experienced illicit surveillance on my whereabouts when the Álvaro Uribe administration was in office. There were intelligence leaks that reached European states that allowed for the continued targeting of political exiles. This just shows the grave magnitude of the implications of this recent episode of military espionage. Now, what can be done? Danilo finished his presentation with some very relevant questions. What can be done to ensure effective civilian oversight on military intelligence? It is done in many countries throughout the world, and as I've mentioned, it's concerning when any surveillance is done illegally. I think to reach an answer, it is necessary to insist what we've been proposing for many years. The intelligence reports need to be declassified. It's been a serious issue since the 1970s. It occurred a lot in the 80s, and it happened a lot under the Uribe administration. And unfortunately, it is happening now under the Ivan Duque administration. The public should be able to know what these intelligence reports sought to do. This transparency would show willingness for structural reforms. Another aspect that is crucial to keep insisting on is an investigation that establishes the intellectual authors behind the series of illicit surveillance. It's important to identify who benefits politically from this military espionage. As mentioned before, it looks like this includes members from the Democratic Center political party. I believe it is of the utmost importance that it is identified who is responsible and who ordered this to be done, since in the military they follow orders. Behind these military orders, however, there are civilian orders, political beneficiaries per se, that Colombian citizens should be made aware of. I also want to add that it is very important to look at the 2016 peace agreement during this critical juncture. Chapter 2 of the agreement on political participation guarantees a voice for the political opposition. We must continue to insist on the compliance of the peace agreement when discussing this recent episode of military espionage. Another thing I'd like to add, Semana and colleagues at WOLA, as well as other activists in the United States that are currently watching this webinar. Senator Jim McGovern from Massachusetts made a declaration about this recently, and I believe it is essential to ensure that internationally received funds and U.S. military aid are not used to continue these illegal activities. I know this will be a challenge, but the declaration that Senator McGovern made recently to halt U.S. military aid to Colombia while these illegal activities take place is super important. This opens an avenue for social movements in Colombia to keep insisting for U.S. cooperation in upholding human rights. I'm going to provide an example that highlights the gravity of this situation. Recently, in a Colombian news channel, Noticias Uno, they published a report that ties high-level military officials with narco-trafficking groups that have been exporting cocaine from Colombian coasts using the drug cartels in La Guajira region to take cocaine to the United States. It is to say that the way these drug cartels operate is that they obtain this information from intelligence. Drug cartels have information on where counter-narcotic units of the military and police operate, which is to say that drug cartels were somehow given this information from official sources. I believe this example of how intelligence information ends up in the hands of drug cartels brings to light that we live in deep corruption in Colombia that allows official state intelligence to be used in grave wrongdoings, like political persecution, the assassinations of social leaders, and even the export of cocaine to places like the United States. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cesar. We will now hear from Yomari Otergon Osorio from the Lawyers Collective Cajar.
Muy buen día, buena tarde ya, Jimena, compañeros y compañeras de
Hi.
WOLA.
Good
Un
afternoon, Jimena and
agradecimiento a todas
colleagues
las
at WOLA. I want to extend my gratitude to all the organizations of the Colombia Steering Committee that have provided the space to discuss this very important topic about the human rights situation in Colombia, and in particular for those who undertake their roles as journalists, human rights defenders, and those who work for peace in Colombia. Like Cesar Jerez, I'd like to start with a small narrative about the wrongdoings committed by the military against our Jose Alviar Restrepo Lawyers Collective. At the beginning of the 1990s, it was revealed that lawyers from our collective had notes from military and police intelligence about legitimate work we were conducting. At the time, we focused our work in prisons, on human rights defense, and on victims related to forced disappearances. In the 1990s, we were also made aware of miscellaneous military intelligence that identified lawyer Ilirio Uribe Munoz as a sympathizer of the ELN for his work defending political prisoners. From the basis of these facts, which came to light a decade later, we had conversations with the Public Prosecutor's Office in 2006 and 2007 to declassify this intelligence, as well as to address the consequences such intelligence had on the lawyers it targeted. Like Cesar Jerez mentioned, it has many implications. Midway through 2000, Operation Transmilenio was revealed, which was brought forth by the former Administrative Department of Security. Our Lawyers Collective was one of its main targets, but it also targeted over 180 individuals and organizations. The objective of the intelligence wasn't just to obtain information, but also to use the information to delegitimize, attack, and prosecute the targeted individuals and organizations. Though 25 different charges were pressed against individuals responsible for this illicit intelligence, many of the high-level intellectual authors were left untouched in the investigations. These high-level individuals form part of the president's cabinet. Now moving on to post-2011, after the dissolution of the Administrative Department of Security, we have perceived illicit surveillance activities conducted by the police, particularly the Sahel. These wrongdoings have been denounced with the names of the agents and the license plates of the cars they use, but to no results. Even in the framework of the peace agreement, we became aware that conversations that members of our lawyers collective had in Havana were collected through illicit surveillance. We became aware of this thanks to reports published by the Colombian weekly news magazine Semana. Again, this legitimate work to advance peace was being criminalized through this targeted surveillance. In the last few years, there has been a series of intelligence episodes that we have become aware of. For example, like the ones that occurred in 2017, as mentioned by Senator Ivan Cepeda, so I won't go into detail. So some questions we'd like answered in this forum. Can the Colombian government hack its citizens? Why does the state security apparatus continue to collect intelligence against its own citizens? What are the effects of the lack of effective civilian oversight? In sum, no. The Colombian government does not have the right to hack its citizens, as noted by the court and the International American Commission on Human Rights. They may use intelligence systems to protect their citizens and state sovereignty and protect security, but the systems can't be used for illegitimate or illegal reasons. Like it was done in this recent episode on members of the opposition, human rights defenders, journalists, and other people who undertake vital work, such as those who advance peace. This means that effective civilian oversight on intelligence is crucial to allow such work to be advanced, but in the past 4 decades, this has been throttled. Second, what or who keeps allowing members of the military to undertake these illicit operations? Well, there's a normalization of the ability to use intelligence resources with a political end. So the proposals of the people who spoke before me are fundamental. There needs to be reforms to the current military doctrine. We must change the idea that people who carry out human rights defense work or form part of the political opposition are enemies of the state. And obviously there are ideas related to the doctrine, like the idea that the work of human rights defender was another form of conducting war, a term in Spanish known as law as war. Victims, judges, and lawyers were considered more dangerous than insurgent groups or were classified under the same threat as insurgent groups for the work they conducted. This concept of law as war was very much ingrained in the former Administrative Department of Security and is very much present today in the current military doctrine. Another thing I'd like to re-emphasize is the absence of civilian oversight. After the intelligence scandal of 2011, Law 1621 was approved in 2013. While some oversight was established with this law, it is important to recognize that there are gaps. In 2014, the group We Are Defenders, Somos Defensores, alerted of an alarming gap in oversight. Article 17 of this law allows for the digital monitoring and that such actions do not count as illicit surveillance. In doing this, the law allows for a series of actions that compile dossiers of citizens that are not overseen by judicial oversight. Under the same law, an advisory committee was created to debug the archives of all the illegally obtained information. However, there were many difficulties in its functioning. Ultimately, recommendations were made that were never implemented. A third aspect on the lack of oversight is that the law creates oversight mechanisms, but does not create other mechanisms that allow for true civilian oversight of these intelligence activities. Finally, we'd like to note, as many organizations have done over the years, that these oversight mechanisms continue to be modified. We've dealt with interceptions of communications, of emails, of phones, but now there are much more ample mechanisms that allow for hackings that are very intrusive and allow for access to our communications. This is why the public needs to be informed on the type of technology that the military and police are acquiring to conduct this illicit surveillance. Also, the Attorney General's office in 2011 had a major discussion about the PUMA system and the way it was allowed to be used. The Attorney General recognized that because the technology is intrusive, it should be retired from use. So, we need to advance with transparency and oversight. My last point regarding all proposals, including those who spoke before me, we believe that first of all, there needs to be security sector and defense reforms. Danilo Rueda noted that this topic was not discussed during the peace process, but it is such an important step to consolidate peace in our country. These reforms have been advocated by the UN Security Council in several places to ensure that transitions from war to peace are accompanied with guarantees of non-repetition. Some aspects related to this discussion is that Colombia needs to have a debate about the size and influence of its military during a post-conflict transition. What kind of monetary budget should the military be given? How are military promotions given, as noted by Senator Cepeda? How are sanctions aligning with Colombia's obligations to international human rights law? How is the military reforming itself from its internal enemy doctrine? A second aspect that organizations like Privas International and Carisma is that there needs to be legal framework about the intrusion on electronic devices. It is a novel topic, but other countries have been able to have more discussions on it than in Colombia. Access to our electronic devices allows for access to our entire lives, to our emails, pictures, videos, passwords to our bank accounts. It's to say that oversight is so crucial. These organizations gave an example about these trespassing situations that affect the privacy of citizens. They must have strong judicial oversight. It should be overseen by the prosecutor's office. Other types of oversight is necessary to avoid intrusions to our private lives. A third aspect is that we must clarify the truth. Since January, the Lawyers Collective made a statement to the Attorney General that requested information about whether the lawyers from our collective were targets of the surveillance, so that we could classify ourselves as victims. In March, the Attorney General responded by negating such claims. Then, all of a sudden, the weekly news magazine Semana revealed in May that lawyers from our Lawyers Collective were targets of this illicit intelligence. So we have insisted to the Attorney General's office and to the prosecutor's office to recognize us as victims, but also to publicly acknowledge the 130 individuals who were targets to this illicit surveillance as victims, and that there could very much be more people targeted. There is a clear correlation with what we faced in 2006 and 2007. These archives should not remain in the hands of the military, since this leads to grave consequences, as noted by Cesar Jerez. This is why we insist on the declassification of these archives, but also that they be removed from the military due to the effects such information can have on the lives of those targeted. Likewise, comprehensive investigations are important. The previous speakers noted that we are not only discussing one wrongdoing. We are talking about a track record of wrongdoings that are complex. We are talking about instances of corruption that could be linked to extrajudicial killings with specific pressure against individuals who are testifying before the Special Jurisdiction for Peace and could implicate high-level officials. This is why comprehensive investigations are so crucial. We want public discussion regarding access, preservation, and dissemination of the intelligence archives, which should be considered human rights archives, as we've discussed throughout this forum. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Jomari. Just before we go on to John Otis, I want to apologize if there are any persons having issues with the chats going in and out. We at WOLA are, for the first time doing such a virtual event, we always want to bring the voices of our partners to the United States, but we're all still learning how to do all of this. So what we're going to do is we're going to continue the way we are going now, but afterwards, we will make sure that we have a full translation of what was stated by everyone today, should there be part of the event that you were unable to hear clearly. So with that, we're going to go to John Otis, and we're also going to switch into English. Again, John Otis is a journalist based in Colombia, and he reports for NPR and the Wall Street Journal, and has authored the book Law of the Jungle. So with that, let's go to John.
Thank you very much, Ximena. And I'd also like to thank WOLA for putting on this event in the Washington office on Latin America. I guess just to start out, I've been here covering Colombia since 1997. And when I first got here, the army was in really bad shape. The military forces of Colombia were losing the war against the FARC guerrillas and the ELN, and there was just one disaster after another. And, you know, military intelligence actually did play a very big role in turning this situation around. Obviously, intelligence can always be abused, but there were a lot of cases also where military intelligence did some good. Intelligence was very important in weakening the FARC. It helped the Colombian government track and identify FARC leaders. For a long time, the military hadn't been able to capture any FARC leaders or do really any damage to the guerrilla organization. And as intelligence improved, army operations improved, they managed to capture some top FARC leaders, and they also pulled off a pretty amazing hostage rescue in 2008 called Operation Checkmate, in which the Colombian military rescued 15 hostages, including presidential candidate Ingrid Betancourt. They rescued 3 U.S. military contractors and a bunch of Colombian police and army soldiers who'd been held just in very inhumane conditions by the FARC for years on end in the jungle. You know, they'd be on forced marches, they're, you know, chained together, that sort of thing. So it was really a big triumph for the Colombian military when they were able to pull off this hostage operation. And as you might know, most hostage operations are pretty bloody. The raid on Entebbe, among others, it's often a big bloodbath, and this one, not a shot was fired. So it was a pretty well done operation, and that just goes to show you what good intelligence, well carried out, can do when it's not abused, when you use it towards the ends that it's supposed to be used for. And, you know, because the military, in using military intelligence, helped to weaken the guerrilla forces, that did help lead to the peace process. It helped lead to the Havana Accords, signed in 2016, and to the demobilization of the FARC guerrillas. And so, again, there's some positive sides to military intelligence, but as this whole panel has been going through, there's, you know, it's become perverted. It's become, intelligence has been used for so many terrible things here as well. And, you know, since Operation Checkmate, which was kind of a high point for the Colombian military, there's just been one scandal after another. I remember after reporting on this hostage rescue just a couple of months later, this big scandal broke in which the military had started, to run up their supposed body counts of guerrillas. They ended up killing lots of innocent civilians and dressing them up as guerrillas and claiming them as part of their body count in order to get benefits and more vacation time and medals and all sorts of things. After that, there were a number of intelligence scandals that the other panelists have sort of mentioned. The main intelligence unit here, called the DAS, which is sort of like a Colombian version of the FBI, was actually dissolved due to a big spying scandal. There was spying on the peace process negotiations that were going on, and then just lately this spying scandal that broke out, that included a number of the panelists here, myself included, spying on foreign correspondents, spying on NGOs. It just kind of seems like there's no end to it. One thing that's also kind of alarming too is some of the just sort of amateurish way that they've gone about some of it too. I mean, some of the intelligence I've seen. One of the foreign journalists who was spied on in his file, they didn't have a picture of him. They had a picture of his father. In my case, they sort of went through my Facebook pages and pulled off a bunch of photos and put them into my file that didn't really have to do with anything, anything important that I was covering. Another alarming thing that you see is that when these intelligence scandals happen, not only are they sort of recurrent, but it just seems like there's not too much in the way of punishment or really deep reforms to try to get to the bottom of this. In this latest spying scandal that broke out, it was actually broken by Semana magazine, which has done an incredible job in investigating these scandals. And the day that the scandal broke, the Defense Ministry hastily called a press conference in which they fired about a dozen military officers, but they didn't really say what they'd been fired for or what their involvement was. And also, the way you bury the news, as you know, is you announce something like on a Friday evening on the weekend, and that's what happened here. It was on Labor Day here. The Latin America's Labor Day is May 1st. And it was Friday at the very end of the day, so it seemed pretty obvious that they were trying to bury the news. And again, there's all kinds of mea culpas and people coming out and saying, government officials coming out and saying, we are going to get to the bottom of this. A few days after all of this, I appeared on an interview program along with the commander of the Colombian military forces, General Luis Navarro, who specifically stated, we're sorry about this. We're going to get to the bottom of this. It's not going to happen. It's not an institutional thing. It's not what we're about. But again, that's great if they do get to the bottom of this, but usually it doesn't, just doesn't seem to happen. It's a little hard to say what they wanted out of, in our case, as foreign correspondents, what they were looking for. Maybe it was just sort of a fishing expedition to see who we were talking to. I'm not sure. Maybe it was a way to try to get to, some of the people we talked to, some of the people we interview. Just in the past couple of years, I've been with the ELN guerrillas, talking to one of their top commanders. A few months ago, I was down in Tumaco on the Pacific Coast talking with FARC dissidents. But we do this because we're trying to, find out what these people are doing and explain to the greater public, why members of the FARC have rejected the peace process and have gone back to war, gone back to drug trafficking, why they've decided to take up arms again. That's what journalists do. And it would be nice if the intelligence agencies here would just kind of realize that that's what we do. They should realize it's the job of NGOs and human rights groups to do what they do. But for some reason, there seems to be kind of a bias that they think that because we may write critical stories from time to time about the institution, that we have to be looked into, that we're sort of suspect people. Now, the other sad thing I see about this is in my reporting duties of going around Colombia, after the peace process, we're 4 years after the peace treaty was signed. We're almost 4 years later, and the Colombian country starting to get more dangerous. I mean, there's these FARC dissident groups that are mainly involved in drug trafficking and illegal mining popping up all over the place. The ELN is still out there. There's lots of drug traffickers. Just as much cocaine is being sent up to the US and to Europe as ever before. So Colombia has lots and lots and lots and lots of legitimate enemies that the intelligence services should be looking into. But instead, you know, some of these intelligence operations seem to go awry and they end up looking into the wrong people. So with that, I guess I'll turn it back to Jimena and let some other people get their 2 cents in.
Thank you so much, John, and we really appreciate all the amazing work that you do reporting on these stories that we believe don't get enough attention. Now we're going to hear from Nicolas Bedoya, and for those who came in later, he is a member of the Vela Collective and editor of the Nudo del Paramillo Peace Observatory. He's written for numerous publications, including Bloomberg News and Verdad Abierta, and he joins us after being profiled by the Colombian Army in its special case number 1 as the source of New York Times and these former Andes editor Nick Casey. So with that, Nicolas.
Hello, Jimena. Thank you for everyone who's watching, to all our viewers, to Wola for inviting me to this event. I believe kind of the input that I can put into this whole conversation comes from a very local context, and so I'm going to try and like kind of bring this down to the ground as to what this means for me and for the whole region which I was covering. My work was very localized. I focused on El Nudo del Paramillo, which is in northern Antioquia and southern Córdoba. I'm young. I'm just 28 years old. I moved to Colombia in 2013 after graduating from the George Washington University. After that, I subsequently ended up moving to Ituango, Antioquia, which is considered the gateway to El Nudo del Paramillo. I did this because I wanted to witness firsthand the peace process, the unraveling of the peace process, as well as the construction of Colombia's largest hydro dam. So I moved to Ituango in 2015, and from the beginning, from the first time I got there, I saw abuses towards the press. And to that end, I'm going to cite a few cases. In 2015, when I got there, a colleague from Teleantioquia had his house raided, his door torn down. He got shoved to the ground, put on his neck, a gun pointed at his head, all for supposedly being militia of the FARC. Ironically, I mean, this was all clearly an attempt at intimidation because, I mean, the guy had previously wrote that the army was occupying the Central Politécnico, which is an educational institution. After that, in 2016, at the end of 2016, I myself am forced to sit down with the local battalion commander after rumors were being spread in town by battalion soldiers that I was a guerrilla for the work I was doing covering the peace process. And subsequently after that, in 2018, I am forcefully displaced from Ituango after having published myself and having helped the New York Times publish the first reports on the FARC dissidents in the country. And then after that, at the beginning of this year, another colleague, reporter for Radio Nacional, was displaced from Ituango. So, you know, in places like Ituango, all of this question about press freedom has always been on the table, and we've been trying to address this. What's particularly concerning about this case, and to this end, I'd really like to highlight the work and support we've been receiving from La Fundación para la Libertad de Prensa, the Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, La Asociación de Prensa Internacional de Colombia, with their support that they've been giving us. But there are cases, I mean, there's things about this case of espionage in particular that are different from previous cases. At least 30 of those profiled of the 130 were journalists, including foreign journalists like myself. I myself am a dual national. I was born and raised in New York, but my parents are Colombian, and so I have dual citizenship. Many of the journalists profiled were young, like myself. Many of us were affiliated with universities. For example, Rutas de Conflicto, which was signaled in the report by Semana, is part of La Universidad del Rosario. I myself, since last year, have been a contributor to the Latin American News Dispatch, which is a publication from New York University by journalism graduate students. And a lot of us are also freelance and photojournalists, which imply, a much higher risk of working because, we're forced to be on the ground, getting the pictures, very in the situation. And, we don't count with the support of like a large publication. So, there's a higher risk for us working as freelancers. And it's particularly concerning that the profiling was highly focused on identifying sources and who we were connected with. In the Semana article, I appear, in the second diagram with just a picture it said that I studied in the U.S. and that I lived in Ituango and that I was apparently a sympathizer of the Polo political party, which is not true. I don't know where they got that, but I was linked with Nick Casey and other colleagues as well because of our work was very collaborative and we helped each other out and to reach larger audiences and try and inform what was happening, and in my case specifically in El Nudo del Paramillo. Something that connects this kind of wide spectrum of targeted journalists is that the one common denominator is, we were all talking about the army, which would seem to indicate that they don't like people talking about them. So, to that end, the scandal was revealed in January. The government authorities didn't really act on anything for 3 months. 3 months of investigations were delayed. In light of this, in March, the Fundación para la Libertad de Prensa asked the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to grant protective measures to those implicated in the scandal. And then on May 2nd, they again repeat the request to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, this time with the list of names identified those in the Semana article. So we're waiting to hear back from that evaluation, but hopefully, those protective measures will be granted. Because I know of several colleagues that do feel at risk and would like those protective measures and even to leave the country. To all of the audience who's watching, there's a lot that can be done from DC. To this point, I have not received any word from any state government agency or official to try and clarify the situation. It would seem that by getting rid of 12 officials that the government is trying to kind of push this all under the rug, and that's something that we definitely don't want. We want to know the extent of the surveillance. We want those documents declassified, like the other panelists before me have said. And so to that end, we would really appreciate, any attempt to lobby the U.S. State Department, the Defense Department, to hold Colombian authorities accountable for abuses in military intelligence aid, and contact congressmen, congresswomen to make sure that that's held accountable, and also to lobby the Colombian government to clarify, this egregious violation of press freedom. Again, the removal of 12 officials does not solve this. We still have so many answers, so many more questions than we do answers. And to that extent, the Fundación para la Libertad de Prensa released a communique on May 3rd titled, "Why Are You Surveilling Us?" Which lists public questions to the Duque administration to clarify what was going on. And, this is particularly concerning in my case, because freedom of the press in Ituango is extremely important, especially now at a time when the violence there is rising at an astonishing rate. In 2018, when I was forced to leave, it ranked among the top 3 municipalities with the highest homicide rate in Colombia. And to date, since in just this year, 3 of my sources have been killed. And so I really need to know the extent of the surveillance, because it's something that puts me at risk and all of my sources at risk, and everyone who trusted me and makes all my work possible. And at the end of the day, all I'm trying to do is shine a light so that we can understand the conflict that's happening in the Nudo del Paramillo to try and find a way out of it, or at least so that authorities can act. So to that end, I think that's all I have to say.
Great, thank you, Nicolas. So now we're going to turn to some commentaries from Colombia human rights experts, and we're going to start first with my colleague here at WOLA, Adam Isaacson, the Director for Defense and Oversight.
Thank you, Jimena. So, I'm just going to give a few comments here for a few minutes. And the question is, what's going on here? I've been struck over the past year that many of the targets of the military spying and many of the sources for Semana's revelations are military officers themselves. That's new. That almost never happened, when the military was working with the AUC paramilitaries, or when it was committing false positive killings, or when the 20th Intelligence Brigade in the 90s had to be disbanded, or when the DAS was committing so much espionage of civilians. Back then, you had very, very few whistleblowers on the inside with the military, but now there are many who seem to have come forward and who are being targeted. And it seems to speak to a division within the armed forces. You could sort of call it, the officers doing the spying and the officers being spied on, but maybe that's a bit too glib. But certainly you could cite, the phrase attributed to General Villegas, who was heading the brigade, or rather the task force in the Catatumbo region. According to Semana, in January of last year, he got up and told their assembled officers, quote, "The army of speaking English, of protocols, of human rights is over. If we need to carry out hits, we'll be hitmen. And if the problem is money, then there's money for that." General Villegas continues to hold a high command position. Or when General Alberto Mejia, who headed the army and the armed forces under President Santos, a moderate officer who is supportive of the FARC peace process and who rewrote military doctrine, a lot of officers grumbled that he is one of those officers who was raised as a baby. He got to crawl on carpets. So there's like a cultural division that was always there. And yes, the military across the board is a profoundly conservative institution. They're invested in the status quo. They want to defend their institutional interests. It's like that in almost any country, but there is a spectrum. Some officers are actually thinking about how the institution should function within a democracy. And they have war colleges that are thinking about what the current threats really are and how to prepare for them. On the other end, there are other officers who have aligned themselves pretty openly with landowners and local power, political bosses, who've aligned themselves in some cases with organized crime. Some have adopted a definition of threats that tracks pretty closely with the definitions that are followed by Colombia's most extreme right-wing party, the Centro Democrático, which currently is in power. For them, a threat to those interests, the interests of landowners, political bosses, is a threat to Colombia. They're the ones who might feel threatened by reporters or judges, or even by some of their fellow officers. They're the ones who are going to fight dirty. They're the ones who are going to condone sending death threats and obvious following and surveillance. That's terrible for the institution. It's bad for Colombia, especially when Colombia right now is a country where a social leader is killed every day and a half or so. Now, I think actually over the years, some exposure to U.S. training and our war colleges, our defense academic institutions, might have strengthened the hand of the more moderate wing of that spectrum, at least in latter years. So did the so did the whole push to become affiliated with NATO in the last couple of years. But these more hardline tropero officers, the officers who can't tell the difference between defending the interests of a few landowners and defending the nation, they're still there. And Colombia's governing party prefers them. Now, the division between these two ends of the spectrum is sharper now, I think, because there's no all-consuming enemy to galvanize the forces. There's nothing like the FARC. I mean, you've got the ELN, you've got the disidencias, you've got the grupos armados organizados, but they're not as compelling. Losing the FARC has sharpened the divisions, I think, within the military. Without the FARC, the armed forces still have a mission, but it's dispersed and fragmented. There are more centrifugal forces. There's, lots of smaller armed groups. There's also drug interdiction always as a mission, environmental protection. There's always eyes on Venezuela. There's building roads, the occasional territorial stabilization project. The machinery that was built in the military to fight the FARC, though, is still there, even if the FARC is not. The peace accord did not cause any reforms in that machinery, and that machinery can be misused and apparently is being misused, including for criminal purposes. We've seen a lot of scandals in the last year in Colombia's military, using body counts as a measure of success again, the killing and cover-up of the killing of a former FARC combatant, the covering up of a bombing that killed children, several corruption scandals, a really bad year. And so this sort of post-FARC Centro Democrático in power moment is a hugely fragile moment for Colombia's military. There are officers in Colombia's army who are unhappy with the direction the military is taking under the current government, and that's clear from what's being leaked. But the other part of the military is in danger of going seriously rogue. General Nicasio Martinez, who headed the army for most of 2019, was either part of that segment of the army, or at least he was extraordinarily tolerant of them. That tolerance needs to stop, and those who do tolerate it need to be held accountable. The internal fight becomes more visible as new revelations leak to the media, and the Operación Bastón that Ivan Cepeda mentioned was very important. It found that 16 of Colombia's 63 generals are currently under a cloud. It's perplexing that so many of those cases have not moved within Colombia's Prosecutor General's office, and a lot of the blame for the lack of progress lies there in the Fiscalía. The army does need a serious purification involving well-resourced, well-protected Fiscalía prosecutors and investigators. No more tolerating behavior that undermines Colombian security. No more circling the wagons around bad officers. But we're not going to have great visibility on how that purification goes. A lot of it is internal. One time we do have visibility are the annual promotions. Who gets to go to the course of generals? Who gets promoted to general? That process is crucial to see who's getting rewarded and who's getting left behind. Meanwhile, until that happens, until there's more of a purification, Colombian democracy is wounded. And I worry about what we don't know about. For instance, the intelligence machinery that may be deployed against people organizing the social protests that have arisen since last November. So to conclude, U.S. policy is important here. We know that Army intelligence units get U.S. assistance. Much of that assistance comes through accounts like the CIA's budget that we just can't get information about. We know from Semana about equipment transfers like Stingray cell phone listening devices, but we don't know much more. We need more transparency over U.S. assistance, and the U.S. Congress can help us to get that. We need the U.S. Congress to make sure that U.S. assistance to these units stops unless all of those responsible for the spying, even at the highest levels, are not being held accountable in Colombia's civilian court system. The Leahy law cuts off aid to units that commit gross violations of human rights with impunity. And if there is impunity, if weeks from now we hear that nothing more is happening, if these investigations and trials are going nowhere, then the aid to these intelligence units should stop immediately. And the U.S. government needs to be more vocal about the kinds of officers it wants to work with and be associated with. Even if it means butting heads with the Centro Democrático, if that party is promoting and installing officers and tolerating behavior of officers who are undoing many years of reform, then it's time to socially distance from those officers and to protect much more actively the prosecutors, investigators, and whistleblowers inside and outside who are trying to hold them accountable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam. So we're going to switch to simultaneous translation because of all of the translation issues. And our next speaker is going to be Liliana Kristesevich, of the director of Sahil, and she will talk in Spanish and I will translate in English simultaneously.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Jimena. La verdad es que es un gusto poder estar debatiendo con ustedes este tema que es tan importante para la protección de los derechos humanos y la libertad de prensa en Colombia. Voy a
So thank
rescatar.
you very much for this opportunity. Thank you, Jimena. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today to talk about this issue that is so crucial to the protection of human rights and the freedom of expression in Colombia.
Voy a rescatar 2 o 3 ideas para remarcar algunas de las reflexiones que hicieron quienes me precedieron en el uso de la palabra.
So I'm going to basically put out there 2 ideas to highlight some of the main points that were made by the previous panelists.
El primer punto es que aquí lo que estamos viendo es una práctica que persiste sobre el tiempo y que pone en riesgo no solo la privacidad, sino la vida, la libertad de expresión, la defensa de derechos, el ejercicio de la política de aquellos que están afectados.
So the first thing is that we're seeing here a persistent practice that is continuously putting at risk not only the privacy, but also the right to life, the right to liberty of expression, the overall human rights, and the political activities of a group of people.
No se trata exclusivamente de una serie de hechos que pueden ser incómodos. Son hechos por parte del ejército colombiano que son sumamente peligrosos porque se dan en un contexto de asesinatos selectivos, de líderes sociales y de otras personas, y en un contexto de absoluta impunidad frente a las amenazas y ataques a periodistas y a miembros de estos otros sectores sociales.
This is because this is not just a mere uncomfortable revelation, but it is something that's taking place in a very dangerous context where we're seeing selective assassinations of social leaders, attacks against journalists, and most of these attacks are in impunity. In total impunity are the threats and attacks, the death threats and attacks against several civil society sectors.
Entonces, creo que es importante, mirando el pasado y mirando al futuro, entender que algunas de estas acciones de espionaje ilegal son parte del preludio de graves violaciones de derechos humanos, pero también son parte de una trama a partir de la cual se construyen esas graves violaciones de derechos humanos.
So it's important not just to look at the past so that we can understand the future, but it's important to understand that these illegal activities are often the prelude of large-scale human rights violations. So we need to see it as part of this trajectory of violations that can turn very grave.
Uh-huh. Y cuando estaba hablando el joven periodista Bedoya, yo creo que él hacía una reflexión acerca de lo que había ocurrido con algunas de sus fuentes, y creo que el ejército, cuando espía a los periodistas, cuando sigue a las personas defensoras de derechos humanos, a los políticos, muchas veces no solo pone en riesgo a estas personas, sino pone en riesgo a sus fuentes, a quienes realizan denuncias, a testigos de casos judiciales, y de esa manera está intentando de manera ilegal interferir realmente con los procesos de responsabilización de las acciones ilegales que ha realizado el ejército colombiano.
So it's important to understand that when the Colombian army spies on human rights defenders, it spies on different journalists, like Nicolas Bedoya mentioned, also is getting information on sources and witnesses of potential judicial proceedings. it is directly doing illegal intervention with respect to getting accountability for these violations.
Entonces, la pregunta que nos hacemos desde el SEGIL, habiendo visto varias iteraciones de esta práctica recurrente de vigilancia ilegal, es cómo lograr que cese y que no se repita, cómo parar la práctica de espionaje, interceptaciones ilegales y las graves violaciones de derechos humanos que involucra.
So the big question that we have here at my organization, SEGIL, is after seeing these types of activities of illegal surveillance and spying happening over and over, how do we actually stop these practices? What can we do to make sure that this doesn't continue to repeat itself?
Y lo que ocurre regularmente en Colombia es que hay alarmas, sorpresa, una pequeña depuración de algunas manzanas podridas, de personas que están involucradas en estas acciones ilegales, pero no hay realmente una revisión profunda del alcance de la inteligencia en una democracia, las medidas necesarias para proteger el ejercicio de la libertad de expresión, la defensa de derechos humanos y el establecimiento de responsabilizaciones acabadas y completas frente a aquellos que han participado en estas actividades de espionaje y vigilancia ilegal.
So what usually happens in these situations in Colombia is that at first there's a bit of alarm. There is, a little bit of fanfare that leads to a small purge of some of the rotten apples, as they're designated, in these illegal activities. But we don't see a real deep revision of the level of these operations that would really go to the heart of, to what extent is intelligence intervening in the democracy? To what extent is it affecting the freedom of expression, the rights of human rights? And so what we really want to see here is the establishment of real responsibilities that are complete of all who participated in this illegal activity.
Y para eso, en el movimiento de derechos humanos tenemos una frase que me gusta mucho, que es que para que haya un nunca más, uno tiene que saber cuál es el nunca más qué es lo que pasó. Saber la verdad es fundamental para no repetir los hechos violentos y las graves violaciones de derechos humanos.
So in human rights, there is a well-used phrase, which is, in order to find out the never again, you sort of need to know basically who was behind that never again. And to know that, you really need to know the full truth of what happened.
Y para que exista ese proceso de desclasificación de información, de verdad, para entender hasta dónde llegaron, el señor Jerez hablaba acerca de la evidencia de seguimientos en Europa, pero en enero hubo unos artículos de prensa que daban cuenta, por ejemplo, de seguimientos ilegales en Costa Rica. Yo recuerdo como abogada de los temas de las chuzadas del DAS haber visto evidencia sobre seguimientos ilegales en Brasil y en Ecuador, en Estados Unidos. Entonces creo que existe un entramado de hechos, de personas que en este momento están en riesgo, de lugares que están en riesgo, que no conocemos. Entonces, para que esto cese, para de mínima proteger a la gente, proteger a las fuentes, a las víctimas, a las personas defensoras de derechos humanos, a las y los periodistas que están vinculados como víctimas a estas situaciones de vigilancia ilegal, necesitamos una verdad muchísimo más amplia, la que nunca ha permitido el gobierno colombiano.
So, an interesting thing that was mentioned that César Jerez said, which I think is really important and goes to the heart as to why we have to declassify all of the information so that we really know to what extent this goes is that he said that there was evidence of him being illegally surveyed in Europe. Now, there's also been information in the press, like this past January, it came out that there had been illegal surveillance in Costa Rica. And myself, as a lawyer for the DAS case in the Inter-American system, I also saw within those archives evidence of illegal surveillance in both Brazil and Ecuador, the United States. This really tells us that this situation is far bigger and far broader and involves a lot more people than we're fully aware of. And so if we want to minimally protect all of those people concerned, and that can be the sources, the human rights defenders, the journalists, and the victims, we really need to have that broader truth and information revealed. And unfortunately, this is something that the Colombian government has always denied us the ability to find out.
En las últimas semanas nos hemos acercado tanto a la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos como a las Naciones Unidas para pedirles que interpelen al gobierno colombiano para generar estos procesos de verdad, de responsabilización, de revisión de prácticas y políticas. Y una de las medidas que estamos pidiendo, a la luz de otras experiencias en la región, es que se genere, que se establezca un grupo interdisciplinario de expertos, expertas independientes bajo el paraguas de la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos para coadyuvar a las instituciones colombianas que estén haciendo parte de la investigación de estos hechos y también para hacer sugerencias de política pública, de medidas legislativas, de medidas de verdad y de pedidos de disculpas públicas que ameritan las personas afectadas y la sociedad colombiana en su conjunto.
So what we've been doing in the past couple of weeks is reaching out to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights as well as the United Nations systems to ask that they intervene in this situation with the Colombian government in order to figure out, what needs to be changed in terms of practices, what responsibilities need to be had, and what revisions are needed, both in terms of current practices and policies. One recommendation we have and we've made is that an interdisciplinary group of experts with both male and female experts under the umbrella of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights is brought together to help come up with what should be done, basically, and work with the Colombian institutions implicated in all of this, and to suggest what policies need to change, what truth measures need to take in place, also what public apologies need to be said to the victims of this situation.
Y bueno, tenemos la expectativa de que la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos emita las medidas cautelares a las que hacía referencia el periodista Bedoya y que están siendo patrocinadas por la Fundación de Libertad de Prensa, así como otras medidas cautelares que están pendientes de acción inmediata de aquellas personas que han sido afectadas por la vigilancia ilegal, y esperamos también que las Naciones Unidas, en conjunto con la Comisión Interamericana y también de manera independiente, pueda seguir interviniendo, aportando al esclarecimiento de estos hechos y al establecimiento de responsabilidades y de medidas de no repetición.
So in closing, I want to say that it is our great hope that the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights quickly grants these protective measures to people affected, in particular those that were referred to by Nicolas Bedoya, some of which are being presented by FLIP and other organizations, as well as other necessary measures needed that may be pending for affected persons through this whole illegal surveillance situation. It is also our hope that the United Nations in conjunction with the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights, and also independently and outside of that collaboration, contribute to intervening for there to be truth, and also for there to be the adequate measures put in place so there's non-repetition of these crimes. Great, thank you, Viviana.
Thank you.
Okay, now we are going to hear from our last commentator, and like I said, perhaps our most important one, Lisa Haugard, who is the Executive Director of the Latin America Working Group, a longtime advocate for human rights in the Americas, and she is the one who basically leads the Colombia Steering Committee, which is the grouping of US-based NGOs that work on humanitarian and human rights issues in Colombia. So with that, we're going to pass it to Lisa, and I'm going to translate into Spanish so that our Colombian participants or other Spanish speakers can understand her.
Thank you, Jimena. I would like to reinforce what Jomari and Viviana said about how pervasive and persistent this problem of illegal surveillance is and how difficult it has been to uproot it.
Yo quisiera primero decir gracias. Segundo, quiero reforzar lo que dijeron Jomari y también Viviana de lo pervasivo o que es este problema de inteligencia ilegal y lo difícil que ha sido tratar de pararlo.
When I first started working on Colombia over 20 years ago, on human rights issues, one of the major demands of the Colombian human rights community was for intelligence files to be purged and for information on human rights defenders to be removed from those files. And that was because the defenders and journalists and others targeted knew that the information collected on them was then used by the military or passed on to paramilitary forces and then used to threaten them, to threaten their families, and to target them for assassination.
Entonces, este tema, cuando yo empecé trabajando sobre derechos humanos en Colombia ya hace más de 20 años, me encontré que el movimiento de derechos humanos, una de las demandas más grandes que tenían en ese entonces, era que los folios de inteligencia, los archivos de inteligencia sean básicamente esclarecidos y purgados, porque ellos entendían que la información que está colectada sobre ellos se estaba utilizando por miembros del ejército o pasado a grupos como paramilitares para amenazar o hasta asesinarlos a ellos.
Yet despite wave after wave of scandal, and despite the shutting down of Colombia's main intelligence agency, the DAS, the problem persists.
Y mismo desde entonces ha habido diferentes olas de este tipo de escándalo, una tras otra, y pese a que se cerró, desmanteló el DAS en Colombia, el problema sigue vigente.
What can stop it? What is needed is a thorough revision of military doctrine and training. Even if there was a recent revision of doctrine, it's not adequate or it's not being followed.
Bueno, ¿qué se tiene que hacer? Lo primero es que hay que revisar de manera muy detallada lo que ha sido la doctrina militar, lo que ha sido el entrenamiento. Y aquí quiero mencionar que pese que tal vez se ha hecho, obviamente lo que se ha hecho no ha sido efectivo o no ha sido suficiente.
What is also needed is a soul searching by Colombia's political leaders to make sure that the attitudes behind this illegal surveillance and this compulsion to spy on and target democratic opposition, press and civil society becomes a thing of the past.
También se necesita de que el mundo político, el liderazgo político de Colombia se mire en su alma y realmente empiece a mirar cuáles son estas actitudes que tienen detrás de estas situaciones y por qué hay esta compulsión de tener que hacer este tipo de actividades contra los opositores democráticos del país y que esto debe parar.
Yes, there really have been some important positive changes in Colombian society. We can see that with the development of the peace accords. We can see that with a greater acceptance of the role of human rights defenders. We can see that, as Adam noted, in the greater role of military whistleblowers and progressive people within the military.
Sí, nadie niega que no ha habido cambios positivos en Colombia. Lo vemos en la sociedad colombiana, en particular con la firma de los acuerdos de paz. Lo vemos con el aumento del papel de defensores de derechos humanos y también, como mencionó mi colega Adam, vemos un papel más grande de personas mismas dentro de estas instituciones que son dispuestos a dar luz a lo que está pasando adentro, que son tratando de reformar el sistema.
But change is still coming too slowly and backlashes are happening too often.
Pero el cambio no está sucediendo lo suficientemente rápido y vemos que las represalias vienen muy rápido.
What can be done? The Colombian government must ensure that those who ordered this spying are punished. But more than that, it must make public who ordered this, why, and how it was carried out, fully exposing this scandal to daylight. It must make sure there are changes in military doctrine and political culture.
Okay, so lo que necesitamos es que el gobierno de Colombia exponga básicamente todo lo que ha estado detrás de todo esto para que se puedan entender de todo. ¿Quién ordenó? ¿Por qué ordenaron? ¿Quiénes participaron en todo esto? Se necesita exponerlo todo y también hay que hacer cambios en la doctrina militar.
And it must purge the files, so the intelligence files, so democratic actors are not spied upon again. Finally, it must work with the targets of illegitimate spying to make sure they have the protective measures they need and deserve.
También tiene que limpiar todos estos archivos que tienen esta información y tienen que trabajar con las personas que fueron víctimas de todo esto para asegurar que tengan todas las medidas de protección necesarias para protegerse y asegurar que esto no suceda de nuevo.
But just as Colombia must grapple with why this keeps happening, so must the United States. More than 2 decades of massive U.S. aid and training has not changed sufficiently this deadly military intelligence culture. The U.S. must completely and openly reevaluate our role as supporters and suppliers of equipment and training for military intelligence.
So, just as Colombia needs to do some changes, we also must do some changes in the United States. After 2 decades, entonces, como Colombia tiene que hacer unos cambios, nosotros también en los Estados Unidos necesitamos hacer cambios. Después de 2 décadas de una ayuda sustantiva militar y técnica y entrenamiento, no hemos podido cambiar este ejército que utiliza la inteligencia de manera fatal o esta cultura de inteligencia problemática. Entonces, nosotros tenemos que reevaluar a todos los niveles cuál ha sido el apoyo de Estados Unidos en todo esto.
As Adam noted, the Leahy Law must be applied, and anyone who is involved in this illegal surveillance or used U.S. equipment to do so must be barred from receiving U.S. training and equipment. And U.S. military assistance should be withheld until Colombia makes real steps forward in dealing with this latest scandal.
Como mencionó Adam, existe la ley Leahy que básicamente dice que cualquier persona involucrada en este tipo de actividad o que ha utilizado equipos financiados por Estados Unidos tienen que ser llevados a una investigación y a la justicia, pero también es importante que lo que necesitamos hacer es que se pare la asistencia militar hasta que haya una investigación y un cambio total de esta situación.
Finally, Colombia is once again, as many of you know, the most dangerous place in the world to be a human rights defender. If we want to change that for good and for all, this military doctrine and political culture that creates these risks must dramatically change.
Entonces, nuevamente, Colombia es el país que más peligroso del mundo para defensores de derechos humanos, y si nosotros queremos que eso cambie finalmente y para siempre, es muy importante que se cambie esta doctrina militar y esta cultura para poder protegerlos. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Lisa. So, again, we apologize for the different difficulties we had with the interpretations. We have a couple of questions that have come in, and I'm going to basically have the first question that was directed to Senator Iván Cepeda. Bueno, entonces hemos recibido varias preguntas y voy a hacer unas de ellas. La primera es una que está dirigida al senador Iván Cepeda y dice: ¿qué ha hecho el Congreso colombiano en términos de control político y de demandar la entrega de la información recolectada ilegalmente? And so the questioner wants to know what the Colombian Congress has done to do political control in this situation and to demand that the information that was illegally collected is basically made public. Iván?
Bueno, gracias. Esta pregunta puede tener un rango muy amplio, porque la realidad es que desde hace años venimos haciendo debates periódicos, constantes, sobre este tipo de asuntos. Hay que decir que en el último periodo, en el año 2014, hemos tenido ya varios episodios de espionaje y de inteligencia ilegal. Hay que recordar lo que se llamó la Operación Andrómeda, que fue una operación de unos sectores del ejército para hacerle daño al proceso de paz, o también la clausura de lo que se llamó la Sala Gris, manejada por el ejército en la fiscalía, escándalo del año también 2014.
So,
Más recientemente,
voy a traducir, lo siento. Thank you so much. Well, if you ask what we've done, there's really been a broad set of things that we've done because this has been going on for quite a while. For years, we've held periodic debates about this and calling for action on this. For example, in 2014, it was revealed that there were various spying operations and illegal activity in Operation Andromeda, which basically was done by some members of the military to try to damage the peace process. And then he began mentioning another situation called the Gray Room that involved the Attorney General's office.
Gracias. Igualmente, hemos hecho un debate sobre lo que se llamó el Comando General de las Fuerzas Militares, una instancia que también desarrolló operaciones de inteligencia ilegal en el año 2018. En fin, es una lista larga de episodios en los que hemos planteado siempre una serie de estándares mínimos.
So, you know, we also had a whole debate of control when it came to the central command of the military that had been implicated in some illegal activity in 2018. Basically, I can give you a long list of episodes where we've looked into this issue.
Como ya lo decíamos, la reforma de la ley de inteligencia y contrainteligencia, la discusión sobre el sistema de ascensos de la oficialidad en las fuerzas militares, la creación de controles efectivos para los derechos humanos al interior de las fuerzas militares, etc.
So we've worked on reforming the intelligence law and the counterintelligence law. We've also worked on trying to utilize the system of promotions to see whether that could influence things. And we also tried to see how we can effectively insert human rights controls in these forces.
Ahora, simplemente dos palabras, como lo decíamos al comienzo de esta sesión, este escándalo, si podemos hablar en estos términos, o este nuevo episodio de inteligencia criminal es distinto. Es un escándalo o un episodio que tiene connotaciones mucho más profundas porque atañe a la corrupción, a los vínculos con el narcotráfico, al problema del asesinato de líderes sociales, al problema de la democracia en Colombia, en todos los, digamos, en todos los aspectos. Así que esos componentes, no porque los otros episodios no hayan sido muy graves también, a mi modo de ver hay que estudiarlos y atañen directamente a Estados Unidos, al gobierno de Estados Unidos, a la financiación de la cooperación de Estados Unidos con el ejército colombiano y a la política antidrogas ilícitas que se ha desarrollado durante tantas décadas entre Colombia y Estados Unidos.
So this scandal, or this new episode of this scandal, because as mentioned previously, there have been numerous scandals, has some connotations which I think are deeper and that we really need to take into account. The corruption, for example, with narco trafficking, the way that this is linked to the killing of social leaders, the way it basically is generating obstacles for democracy in different parts of it as a whole. So while the other scandals are serious, and of course we think of them that way, it's important to understand that in this case, we really need a thorough study of what happened and a study of what has been the U.S. role, what has been the role of the U.S. government, what has been the financing of the U.S. in all of this, and also basically rethinking of the anti-drug policies that our two countries have been putting in place for decades. Bueno. Thank you so much, Ivan. Gracias, Ivan. Okay, well, unfortunately, we don't have any more time for more questions, although I believe this is probably going to be the first of various debates on this issue because it touched on so many crucial issues. With that, I want to just thank all of our panelists and commentators and translators for helping us make this possible today, and for you, the participants, for being a part of this. Quisiera decir que desafortunadamente tenemos que terminar porque se nos acabó el tiempo, pero que ya veo que esto va a ser parte de varios otros discusiones que vamos a estar teniendo porque se mencionaron tantos temas tan amplios y tan importantes y que quería agradecer todos los panelistas, los comentaristas y también los traductores y a ustedes todos por ser parte de este importante evento. We will be fixing the translation issues and putting that on our website, so please stay tuned for any parts that you may have missed. Vamos a ver cómo podemos arreglar los temas que hubo sobre traducción para asegurar que todas las presentaciones se entienden del todo. Entonces, por favor, miren nuestro sitio web en el futuro para ver eso. Que tengan muy buen día. Have a great day.